Get started off real quick. If you guys have any questions during this webinar, just feel free to write them in the chat and we'll answer them as we go. But first off, I just want to talk a little bit about ourselves, and then we'll talk about what shadow is, because I'm sure a lot of you haven't been there yet. But oh, here we go. I got to figure out how to use this. Okay, here we go. So first off, my name is Annalie Cameron, and I am the Education and Community Engagement Lead at Shadow Lake Nature Preserve. So right now, I'm just in charge of coordinating all of our education programming and community events at the Nature Preserve. And so right now with COVID, I'm in charge of creating all of the virtual curriculum. So that's why we are here on this webinar rather than at the Nature Preserve.
Hi, I'm Marina Fletcher, and I'm a recent graduate from Basidiomycota University. I graduated in June, so my last quarter was spent on Zoom, so I've got a little bit of experience, but it's been a little bit. And I got my Bachelor's of Science in Nutrition, and just have a general love of mushrooms and wandering through the forest.
All right, so a little bit about Shadow. So Shadow Lake Nature Preserve was founded in 1999, and we started out with 18 acres of bog habitat. And since then, we have expanded to about 110 acres, including the bog and coniferous forest. We are famous for our peat moss bog. So it is about 8,000 to 10,000 years old and was created by the Puget Lobe Glacier that covered most of Western Washington. So our bog is especially unique because of it being a peat moss bog. It allows for the soil to be very acidic, allowing for a lot of plants and fungi to grow in the bog that does not grow anywhere else in Washington state. So we're really excited to be teaching this class. Hopefully next year we'll be able to host it out at the Nature Preserve. Okay.
All right, so here's just a brief outline of what we're going to be going over in the presentation. We're going to be talking about what fungi are, what are mushrooms, identification of both, common mushrooms in our area in the Pacific Northwest, why fungi are important, and then resources for further learning like foraging practices and ethics, mushroom farming, and edible and medicinal species review. And then we'll do a Q&A at the end. For our learning goals, what we would like you guys to take away from this is just becoming more familiar with different types of fungi. Like when you're out on a walk, being able to sort of pick them out, not necessarily pick them, but be able to spot them as you're walking. And maybe have a little cue into what family they belong to and maybe what they do. You'd be surprised, there are quite a few edible ones in our area and ones that have medicinal value as well. We'll hope that you'll get a view of how to properly use a field guide to ID mushrooms. I've got one here with me that's kind of a goofy cover, but we'll talk about this more at the end. It's called All That the Rain Promises and More. It's a really fun field guide. It's got a lot of anecdotes inside and a lot of good stories that help identify as you go. Learning some interesting facts about the fungus among us and foraging ethics and how to locate reputable foraging resources for further learning. So what are fungus, fungi, fungi, however you feel like saying it? We're going to be talking about primarily two different types, but fungi are a kingdom.
They're one of the 5 kingdoms.
Thank you. Sorry, I've got my notes on the other screen. The 5 different kingdoms are Monera, Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, and Protista. So one thing to keep in mind as far as mushrooms and fungi go, all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. Different things that fit under the fungi realm are things like yeast, mycelium, slime molds, and then I just wanted to make a special note, lichen are not fungi because they have photosynthesis as a method of creating energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so lichen has a symbiotic relationship with fungi, so it's typically paired with a plant that photosynthesizes. Mm-hmm. Okay.
So the different types of fungi, there's 4 different types. We're going to be looking at Ascomycota and Basidiomycota. So we just also wanted to make a nod to Zygomycota, which are molds, which are everywhere. They're on a much, oh man, I'm tripping over my words today quite a bit. They're on a much smaller scale though. So Ascomycota are things like sac fungus or yeasts. So they hold their spores within them. And then Basidiomycota are mushrooms, like the fruiting body of mycelium. So here's some different molds for the Zygomycota. And some different examples of the Ascomycota. So we've got morel mushrooms, and then
and then on the right-hand side is actually the yeast that is used to create penicillin. So we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but a lot of fungus has a lot of medicinal purposes. And one of the biggest ones is that a yeast was used to make a lot of the antibiotics that we all use today.
The Basidiomycota for the mushrooms. There are quite a few different kinds of mushrooms out there. One of them is a club fungi, which produces spores called basidiospores from club-like stalks called basidia. Most common mushrooms belong to this specific group. Okay. So when we're talking about what a mushroom is, and when I say fruiting body, I mean it's sort of a very small part of a much larger organism that we don't really see. So that is the mycelia. So when you picture a mushroom as a fruiting body and the mycelia as it works together, you can kind of think of it as a tree that bears fruit, but the entire tree is underground. So it's basically just below the soil, or it's growing within a tree trunk or a decaying log or a pile of leaves. And then every now and again, it'll put a little mushroom off, like a tree produces an apple or a piece of fruit. So when you pick the mushroom, you're not picking the entire organism, you're just picking the fruit that it puts off. So there are tons of different types of mushrooms, thousands and thousands of species. Some of the more general ones are guild mushrooms, boletes, coral fungi, teeth fungi, polypores, puffballs, earth stars, cup fungi, chanterelles, jelly fungi, morels, and false morels, and stinkhorns. A lot of lovely names. When you're out for a walk or out in the wild and you're trying to ID a mushroom, there's a lot of different structures and a lot of different shapes that they come in. So here we've got a few of those different ones depicted. Some mushrooms have gills that release their spores on the underside of their cap. Some have pores that look almost like a sponge, or if they're even more fine, it can look like a piece of foam maybe. Some have ridges, which sort of resemble gills, but they're a bit thicker. And some have teeth, which I find, depending on the size of them, are sort of easy to mistake for pores, but they kind of like hang down and cascade. So that's always my favorite one to see out in the wild, because I'm like, it's not something that you see as often as the rest of them. You can look at gill attachment for identifying different species and cap morphology. You can also look at where the stem or stipe, as it's called, sits within the cap. Some of them sit centrally and some of them sit sort of off to the side. And that can all help you ID if it's something edible or something you don't want to be picking. Here are some gilled mushrooms. This is a huge, huge group of mushrooms. Probably, I think the most common, especially when you're in a grocery store. One of the more interesting mushrooms that I found in this group is something called an inky cap, which, based on its name, actually you can use for ink. It's sort of got like a furry looking cap, and once you pick it, or as it matures in the wild, it sort of just liquefies into this dark goo. And if you pick it and take it home and stick it in a jar on the counter for several days, it'll just turn into ink, and you can use it to write with.
How cool.
Boletes is another huge group. These ones are really common as far as culinary use goes. In Italy, a porcini is a really common culinary bolete. In France, they're called ceps. In Germany, steinpils. I believe I'm probably mispronouncing that. It's not one I'd heard before. And then in the Pacific Northwest, king bolete is one of the more popular edible ones. There are also quite a few inedible ones. So we'll definitely talk about foraging practices at the end. They tend to grow in coniferous forests. Some are inedible, some are edible. The chestnut variety is one of the most common edible ones, along with the king. Right. So this is an interesting one. It's a coral fungus that's pictured. The whole family of coral, club, and fan-like fungi is a non-traditional looking mushroom, to say the least. Armillaria is one of the more common ones. We got some sides of that later on in the power presentation. One interesting one from this group is called a cauliflower mushroom, and it grows like a head of egg noodles. I don't know if that makes a good picture for you guys, but it sort of just looks like this big white head of cauliflower or head of egg noodles growing in the wild. And I hear those ones are pretty good. I haven't had the opportunity to try them myself. So this is an example of a spine or tooth fungi. It's the same sort of intermittent title that's used to describe the same group. Lion's mane is the one that's pictured that is white and sort of cascading. That one has some medicinal uses as well. I believe it's good for immune support and neurological support. Sometimes you can buy it as a supplement even. And I think I found it at farmers markets before. It's got definitely a sort of a strong seafood taste. I've heard it makes really good sort of vegan replacement for crab and crab cakes. It's an interesting way to use it. It's definitely pretty waterlogged though. So if that's one that you buy at a store or a farmer's market, you want to like wring it out before you cook with it. Mushrooms retain a lot of water. This picture is one that I took of a tooth fungus, and I didn't really realize it was that at first until I got the picture from underneath. Because from the top, to me, it looks like a polypore or shelf fungus, which we'll be talking about next. And so I was surprised to see from the underside that it was a lot shaggier. So I think this one's called Bondarzuia montana or mesenterica. My Latin's not super strong, so I apologize for that. But all of the spine or teeth fungi appear to have like a shaggy or spiny underside. One of the more popular ones that I've been seeing a lot this year is called a hedgehog mushroom, and that's part of the spine and teeth fungi group. So these are polypores. They grow on the side of hardwood trees, of wood trees of many different kinds, and their structure is really dense. So they're not a super popular culinary mushroom. As you can see, I sort of have that nutrition and culinary inclination. So I talk a lot about, oh, this mushroom's really good in this dish. A lot of them you don't want to eat. You definitely don't want to eat when you're going out for the first time foraging. So the ones on the top right are, well, for me it's the top right. I'm not sure what the orientation is for you, but the thicker one with a white stripe around the edge, that is sort of a conch type of polypore. The more colorful ones with a green stripe, those are turkey tails, which are really great for their medicinal value. They also support immune system and neurological function. A lot of mushrooms do, I find. Well, a lot of the medicinal uses for specific ones tend to help with immune support, which is great. And then I'm not quite sure what the larger picture species is, but there's tons. If you walk through the forest, you're pretty much guaranteed to see a polypore in some kind. These little guys are called puffballs. I think they're one of my favorites because they have always grown in my yard growing up. So we've always seen them, and usually by the time I spot them, they're a fairly dark brown color and kind of papery on the outside. The structure of these is such that the center, when it's more mature, is filled with spores. So if you bump it or step on it, it shoots out through the center like a geyser, which is really interesting to watch, and also kind of makes you reel back being like, what did I just breathe in? You should be okay though. They're low to the ground. So unless you're crawling around, I wouldn't worry about it too much. When they're young, this specific type is solid in the center. And so if you cut it in half, it's completely white. As it matures, that white center sort of liquefies, turns brown, and then becomes spores. These ones you can identify because they have those little brown spots on the outside. You can actually brush those off, and there's sort of divots and pock marks where they once were. So that's one of the identifiers for this specific kind, which is Lycoperdon perlatum. They're about the size of a ping pong ball. So the genus for puffballs is Calvadia, which the Latin root of is calva, meaning scalp, skull, or bald head, which kind of makes sense for the shape of them. And they are a type of ascomycete, as I said, with the spore production. Some of them from this group can grow to the size of a bowling ball or larger. I've seen pictures of people holding them, and they're about yay big, maybe beach ball size. There's quite a few different edible species in this group. There's also, as a fun fact, apparently Native Americans used to use the smaller ones in a game where the goal was to hit the mushroom back and forth to each other without letting it touch the ground. And it was called puff rut, or is at this point called puff rut. So that was one of the interesting stories from the field guide that I have, all that the Rain Promises and War. It's got a lot of interesting little stories in there.
How funny. All right.
Okay. This one, the first time I saw it in the forest, I didn't really know if it was a mushroom or not, but I took a picture of it anyway. And then about a day later, I saw like 5 different pictures pop up on Instagram.
Oops, sorry. I don't know why I'm getting those.
Sorry about that.
Sorry, guys. Oh.
We're having some technical issues on our side. So that hole that you see in the center is where the spores shoot out if the ball is disturbed at all. So it sort of comes up and is covered by like this veil, and then that sort of splits and curls underneath it, and you can kind of see that. That sort of makes the star shape. And this is related to the puffballs in that it's also an ascomycete. This guy is a type of cup fungus. I'm not really sure what specific species it is, but cup fungus is a group that is shaped like the name. It's shaped like a cup. So it's got sort of higher ridges around the walls, and some of them even have different structures inside. There's a whole group that's called bird's nest cup fungus, and it's a cup shape that resembles a nest, and it's got several little egg-shaped structures on the inside. So it looks like just little tiny bird nests. So cute. These are chanterelles, which are one of the more popular culinary mushrooms. I'm just making up words. These are in the grocery stores right now. You see them, and they're like $20 a pound, which is personally, I think, wildly expensive, but yeah, they're sort of difficult to forage for and not easy to farm. So that makes sense for why. And there are quite a few different lookalikes out there. So chanterelles specifically have these ridges that are not gills, but are sort of tightly packed and resemble them. And then they branch out at different points. And it's not necessarily like a full branch, because they'll branch and then reconnect and sort of do their own thing. And it is a trumpet mushroom, because the end of it sort of trumpets out. And I think it's delicious on toast with butter after you saute it in the morning. It's one of my favorites. All right, jelly fungi are, for me, when I see them, they're not really something that I think, oh, that's mushroom related, or oh, that's a fungus. I mean, now they do, but when I first saw them when I was younger, I was like, there's just slime on the tree. I don't know what that's there from. Maybe an animal or something. But there's a lot of different species within the jelly group as well. They have some of the best names and are also some of the most disgusting looking. Some of the names are things like dog vomit or bleeding tooth fungi. I think there's a few other names that you might know.
Oh, gosh, there's something that has to do with witch in it too.
That's
Yeah,
what I
they
put
just
in my
have all
notes.
the crazy names.
They do, and they look
Yeah.
the wildest, I think, as well. I don't believe many of these are edible. All right, these are morels, which are also pretty expensive by the pound. You don't often find them in the store unless they're dried. They are a type of Ascomycete as well. So one of the pictures, you've got a profile of them cut in half. So you can kind of see that structure. I thought that was important because there are a lot of false morels that don't have that same structure. So for these, you've got this sort of hollow pocket and these ridges and crevices that spread out from there. False morels have quite a bit different structure. So when you're out in the wild, if you decide to go foraging for morels, it's important to be able to differentiate between the false ones and the real ones, because you could end up poisoning yourself on accident while just trying to forage for food, and we definitely don't want that.
Yes, our advice is when you go foraging for the first time, always make sure that you are with a reputable foraging guide.
I would say for the first few times,
Yes.
definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a picture of a false morel. This is actually called a beefsteak mushroom, I believe. It's, when you cut this in half, it doesn't have the head that's completely hollow. It's actually got a stipe that goes all the way up through, and then what you're seeing, the ridges and the beefsteak structure sort of cascades around it. So it's got more of a typical like umbrella mushroom structure when you cut it in half. I want to make another note on chanterelles that I missed on the last slide. They come in a range of colors. So they come from like a cream color to like a black.
Should I go back to them?
Okay. Oh, not chanterelles. Morels.
Morels.
Okay. My bad. So these come in a huge range of colors, and that depends on like what region they're in, what species they are. There's a type that's called burn morels that likes to grow in areas the spring after a forest fire. So I'm sure there's quite a few of those in California. We might see some of those. We'll definitely see some in Washington this coming spring as well. And those are called burn morels, which makes sense. They tend to be a darker color as well.
Oh, wow. Okay, so we are already at our halfway point. We are just blowing through this presentation. So we're just going to go ahead and take a quick 10-minute break. So if any of you need to take a break to use the restroom, grab some water, feel free to do so. And then Marina and I will be back in about 10 minutes. Here we go. Okay, perfect. All right. So now for the rest of the time, we're going to talk or kind of focus on common mushrooms that you will see in the Pacific Northwest, and then kind of touch on kind of why fungi is so important to our environment.
Let's do this so you guys can see me in there too. Sorry about that. Okay. So we have a huge amount of mushrooms out here in the Pacific Northwest. It helps that we get a ton of rain every year, since that's what brings the fruiting bodies out. So we did talk about chanterelles in the last bit. They are very common here. They're just sort of difficult to find. I mean, I guess I wouldn't say common because they're sort of like when foragers know where they are, it's sort of a coveted secret. Like, I might not take you with me, but I might bring you back a treat kind of a situation. I wanted to talk a little bit about false chanterelles. I know I mentioned them in the last round, but one of the differences when you're looking at chanterelles versus false chanterelles is the way the cap is shaped. So chanterelles are a trumpet shaped cap, and false chanterelles more commonly have a lipped edge, I guess you would say. And then they do also have ridges, but some species have gills instead. One of the cool species of mushroom that you might mistake for chanterelles is something called Western jack-o'-lantern, which actually glows in the dark. It's got a bit of bioluminescence to it. And they're a similar yellow-orange color, maybe more of an olive tone. And they have gills that run all the way down the stalk. So they don't have that same like transition that a chanterelle has. And that's also a note for the false chanterelles is they have got more of a defined stopping point where the ridges end and the stipe or stalk begins. Versus true chanterelles, it's like a smooth transition into it.
Go back to that one. Yeah. I see. Okay. Makes sense. Okay.
But there are quite a few mushrooms that share that golden yellow color, including the honey fungus. So this guy is actually, there are quite a few species within this that are edible, including the stalks of them. Apparently you can sort of fry those up and they make a good treat if you peel the outside of the stalk. They're called Amarilla. I'm just saying that wrong, aren't I? Nope. Amaria. I'm definitely not pronouncing this right. I'm sorry. I'm still not used to all the Latin names, and you'll find foragers who refer to things more as like a common name or a nickname, and some people who will do like a abbreviation of the Latin name and things like that. So there's a lot of different names for the same fungus and a lot of similar names for different funguses. So something to be aware of as well when you're trying to ID something. Oh, sorry. So these guys are called angel wings. And you might see something similar in a grocery store called an oyster mushroom. They have the same structure. Angel wings are basically a white oyster mushroom. And they're technically edible, but there's been some studies recently, or maybe not studies, there have been some cases recently where people have been poisoned by them. So that's something to be aware of if you decide later on to go foraging for things. Keep an eye out for the angel wings and maybe avoid those guys. So there's quite a few species of edible oyster mushrooms, including king oyster, black oyster, blue oyster, pink. They really come in a whole range of colors, and they're also commonly referred to as tree oysters, some by land, some by sea. So they give off sort of a seafood kind of smell, which is one of the reasons why they're called oyster mushrooms, which makes a great substitute for different types of seafood when you're cooking. Like if you're making a seafood stew, oyster mushrooms are a great addition. Yeah. This that group also tends to be one of, sorry.
Go back.
Oyster mushrooms also tend to be a relatively easy one to propagate. They like to grow on wood and trees, but you can also get them to grow on what's called grain spawn. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we talk about mushroom farming. These are Russula mushrooms, one specific type. I believe these ones are called rosy russulas or Russula rosaceae, because they've got the red cap. So there's a whole range of colors for the Russula group of mushrooms. One thing that's interesting about them, and they tend to not be edible so much. They're not really ones you'd want to pick if you're not sure of the exact species, because the majority of them are inedible or toxic. What's interesting about them is they actually morph into a more common or more frequently desired mushroom called called the lobster mushroom. Different type of seafood there. There's a lot of mushrooms that smell sort of fishy. So there's quite a few different seafood names. So this is a lobster mushroom. It's got that bright orange color. And these are actually basically infected russulas. So there's a specific type of fungus that infects the fungus, and it's called the hypomyces. So typically infects Russula brevipes, and that gives you the mushroom. It's got a more brittle flesh than the Russula before it's been infected, but it's got a great flavor. I haven't actually had the opportunity to try one myself. When the stories, what I've heard from friends who are foragers and specifically try to get lobster mushrooms, is they tend to be pretty much infested with maggots. So you kind of have to keep that in mind. You might get a few maggots in the mushroom, and it just comes with the territory. So the way that the hypomyces works is it causes the gills of the mushroom to flatten into ridges, or flatten down almost completely. Like you could see the before and after in these photos as an example. And yeah, it takes on that bright red color, bright red orange. The lactarius group of mushrooms I think is really interesting. So the word lactarius indicates something that's got milk. So for these mushrooms, if you damage or cut the gills, they actually produce this milky liquid. So you get the name lactarius for milk. There's quite a large group of these. And mushrooms are really strange and really interesting. So if this one's a fairly easy to identify group, because if you damage the gills and it produces a white fluid, you're going to know it's a lactarius mushroom. I'm not quite sure how many of these, the specific species of this group, are edible versus not, but I know that there are quite a few that are inedible, as with pretty much all groups of mushrooms. So be careful when you're out and about. This is one of the tricholomas. This is a pretty big group of mushrooms as well, and they come in a lot of different colors, a lot of different types. And they're identifiable because they have a central stem and they have gills. And then the spore color for this group is actually white. So one of the cool things that you could do with mushrooms when you're trying to identify them is take the cap off of the stem, either word works, and you can put it flat on a piece of paper with the gill side down and leave it for, I think, a few days.
24 hours.
24 hours. And it'll actually release all of its spores. And so when you're identifying a mushroom, it might be two different species that look really similar, and the only difference between the edible and toxic one is one's got pink spores and one's got black. Well, if you do a spore print, that'll help you identify which species is which. It also makes some really cool looking art.
Yeah, and the best way, if you do decide to do this, if you find a cool mushroom out in the wild, you leave it undercover, because even wind from you walking by the mushroom can move the spores. So if you leave it covered for 24 hours and then spray it with hairspray, it'll actually make it so the spores do not move and you can keep that spore print as art.
This is another color of Tricholoma. I don't really know too much about these specifically. I think this one might be Flavovirens. I'm saying all of this incorrectly, I know. And I guess this is one of the easier ones to identify just because it's got that yellow color. And it's got that same Tricholoma structure. This is more of a brown version. There's a lot of variance in these groups of mushrooms, and I think this is just a really good example of that. Like when we were talking about the boletes earlier, there's a whole different range of them, and they might be known by different names in different regions, like porcini in Italy and ceps in France. And though they might be similar looking mushrooms, they could be entirely different species, or they could be really similar species with entirely different looks. It goes a bit of both ways. So,
did I skip one?
Maybe.
Yep, there we go.
This mushroom is one of the most like classic and iconic mushrooms when you think of like decorations for Christmas, or if someone's drawing like a cartoon mushroom, it's usually an amanita. So they've got a bright red cap and they've got these white spots all along the top. The white spots actually come from a partial veil that forms as part of the mushroom when it's growing, when it's fruiting. So it'll pop up in this sort of egg. It's just a little white egg poking through the soil, and then that veil will separate and this red body will emerge. And that's the amanita. There's quite a few different ones in this group as well. So this photo was taken by one of my good friends, Margaret. And the other photos were taken in a similar location. So I think they might have just been an older version. But I think they're one of the most striking ones. They are not edible. They are toxic. They might be partially hallucinogenic. There's quite a long history for Amanita muscaria mushrooms. I think there's some ties with different pagan rituals and shamanic practices, and they're definitely one of the most iconic and easily recognized. At least these ones are. I've seen quite a few around. So I live in Woodinville, and I actually saw some growing outside of one of the grocery stores there a few weeks ago. I think we pulled up and I noticed them from the window and I was like, oh my gosh, we have to stop. I have to take a picture of these. And they weren't this bright red color, but I knew that they were amanitas because they had that same egg formation. And I recently found out that they're actually called blushers because they've got this sort of light pink reddish sort of dusty brick color. So they are an amanita, but they are not the Amanita muscaria. Let me see if I put down what kind they are. Rubescens is the blushing amanita.
These are actually also growing in the Shadow Lake bog right now too. So if you actually wanted to come out and see some of the mushrooms that the bog is helping grow, we do trail walk reservations on our website. I just saw a couple of these last week, so I'm not sure if they're still around, but they are out there right now, and they are probably one of the coolest mushrooms I've seen being new to the mushroom world.
Oh, one thing I do want to mention that's not necessarily specific to amanitas, it's specific to pretty much all fruiting mushrooms, is, as I said before, the mycelium, the base below the ground, that's the tree. And the mushrooms that pop up, that's the fruit. So the mycelium exists in that same area, regardless of whether or not the mushrooms are produced or die or are picked. So if later on you get into foraging and things like that, or maybe you just have a specific type of mushroom that you're really fond of and really love looking at, and it really brings in the season for you or something like that, you can go back to the same spot year after year and there will likely be a fruiting of mushrooms of that species in that same spot, unless maybe there hasn't been enough rain or there's been like too many disturbances in the soil. But you could pretty much count on those being there again and again. These little guys are called Mycena. And there's quite a few different ones of these as well. They're sort of just little teeny tiny mushrooms that you see popping up. And they look kind of like a pointed umbrella. For the most part, they all have similar ridges, but they come in a lot of different colors. I've seen purple ones, pink ones, dark brown and black, just in the local area even. I know that there are like blue mushrooms and purple mushrooms that exist around. I just haven't had the opportunity to see them, or maybe I've just not seen them while I was out and about because I didn't quite know what to look for. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of striking colors in the mushroom realm.
So I've been seeing a lot of these popping up randomly in like yards and kind of in like gravel lots. Is this the same species that we see? Or that I've been seeing? Okay.
It could be.
Or it could be a bunch of other species.
It's really hard from anecdotes. It's really hard to just say, oh, that's for sure this mushroom, because there's so many differences and so many small differences that could be a completely different species. But there's a chance it could be related to this for sure. So this is a pink purple version of a mycena. Some of these photos I do want to say are ones that I took personally, or ones that came from Annalie, or ones that were provided by Shadow from a previous presentation. So we've come about them in a lot of different ways, but it's definitely been cool. There's some pictures that were included in the materials that we received that I had never seen before. And so that was kind of a nice surprise. These ones are called Cortinarius. And as you can see, there's a wide variance in color differences. I don't specifically know much about this group. That might be, if you guys are interested in the way that looks, that might be something that we take the time at the end to sort of look up. I've got a few field guides out here at the table with me, so we could definitely look into that. I just haven't had a chance yet. So many species, so little time. This one is part of the coral mushroom, club mushroom family, part of the club. This is a Armillaria. So this is a red one, and this wasn't a picture that I had taken, but based on this picture, I was able to look up in one of the guides that I have that had a pretty well matching corresponding photo. And I was like, oh, okay, I think that I can say that this is probably that specific type of Armillaria. It comes in a wide variety of colors as well, and different types of shape. There's some that are growing in my yard right now that are more of a yellow color. That'd be these guys. And I believe they are Armillaria abatina. And this guy is actually a club fungus. It's not Armillaria, but it's sort of adjacent to that. It's in that same realm. And I believe this one's a Telephora. Oh, can we go back?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
So with the Armillaria and the Telephora, they produce the spores from the tips of the structure. So how they sort of resemble a piece of coral. From the very tips, they produce the spores. So they spread them in that way instead of like from the gills or the pores. This guy is called a shaggy parasol. There are quite a few different kinds of parasol mushrooms. You guys might notice a theme at this point with every family and every species that we talk about. There's quite a few different kinds with quite a lot of variation. This one is, I believe, an edible species. I don't know if the picture that I took is that exact edible one, but I believe it is. I didn't pick it to find out. I sort of just left it for the next person to see on their walk. They have a central stipe, and you can see that collar around it. That's from a partial veil from these guys that also creates that shaggy texture on the top that gives it the shaggy parasol name. And I believe they have black spores. I know there's a spore difference between the toxic one and the edible one, these guys for sure. Plus, I think they just look really cool.
Okay, so now we're going to move into why is fungi so important. And this is just my realm of talking about kind of how nutrients move through our environment. So The first main thing is that they are a part of our decomposers. So how I like to talk about it with my students is they remember the FBI. So that is fungus, bacteria, and insects. Those are all of our decomposers in any environment. And so fungus is one of those big ones. So I have a food web up here that kind of just shows how they work. We have fungus right here, so they can pull nutrients. They can pull nutrients from decaying animals, plants, all of those things, and then they bring those into the soil, and then all the other plants that live in that same area can benefit from that. So Marina and I actually just watched a documentary that we will show you later. It's called Fantastic Fungi. It's on Amazon. And the person who was in that documentary said that fungus are the digestive tracts of our environment. And I just think that is the coolest way to think about them. Without fungus, essentially nutrients would not be recycled, and we probably wouldn't have life today without fungi.
There's a note I want to add as far as being decomposers of like animal matter. There is a type of fungus called cordyceps that actually, the way they work is you primarily see them in insects, but they're really hard to spot because, well, who really wanders through the forest and finds the like decaying body of an ant? That's not really something that you necessarily would look for. But the way it works is the insect sort of ingests the spore, or it gets into its body in some form. Maybe it inhales it, and it grows within them and eventually kills them from the inside out because it's growing within. It's like a parasitic mushroom, and then it'll sort of sprout from their body, and it's like this orange club fungus type. And there's a lot of medicinal benefits from that one too.
Yeah, so again, there's a lot of good for fungus in our environment, and then it also can be pathogenic as well. So another fun fact, if you've ever watched Planet Earth, you may have seen this. There is a type of fungus that can infect an ant and kind of essentially turn it into a zombie and control its brain, and make the ant kind of go where it wants it to go so the fungus can reproduce again.
May or may not be sentient.
All right. And then next up, is the, okay, I can never say this word right, mycorrhizal relationships. So essentially, like Marina was saying with a mushroom, the tree is below ground, and that is what's it called? The mycelium. And the mycelium actually allows for other plants to communicate with each other. And that could be, for example, for a mother tree, if they have their offspring near them and nutrients are sparse, through the mycelium, they can actually communicate, and that mother tree can actually take in less nutrients, so its offspring can take in more. So without that mycelium, our plants wouldn't be able to be as successful with that. So that's a really cool part. Essentially, that fungus, that mycelium, is connecting all of those plants in an environment.
And the mycelium have, depending on the species, they have favorite trees that they like to interact with. So not just on the trees that you find them growing off of, but they, like the mycelium likes to interact with different specific trees. So they're sort of paired up by genetics, I suppose.
Yeah, and then you may have seen this before without noticing it. I know that I have seen this before and just automatically assumed mold. But mycelium can be found in leaf litter. So right now, if you have a leaf litter pile in your backyard from all of your deciduous trees, if you would go out and take a shovel and kind of move some of it over, there's a really good chance that you could see that mycelium growing in there, beginning to break down those leaves.
That might actually be a fun sort of discovery for you guys. If anyone has a large yard with lots of leaves, as they're all falling right now, but if you sort of rake a pile and put it to the side in a few months, if you disturb it, like if you're spinning it into some compost or something like that, you might see the mycelium growing within it.
And you're making a home for lots of insects that rely on those compost piles that provide food to lots of other animals. So that just goes back to the food chain and how we wouldn't be able to survive without fungi.
Right, so mycorrestoration, mycelium and fungi in a forest environment through mycorrhizal relationships, they help plants grow and promote that. But they can also be really good fertilizers. So there's several different types that are great in gardening. There's something called a wine cap. I tried to inoculate the garden at my parents' house with that last year, but it didn't quite take. And that's okay. Maybe it will in a couple of years. Who knows? Maybe the mycelium's just working and hasn't had enough rain yet. But I've heard that that's one that can really help promote crop growth, at least in an at-home garden. I can't speak to scale of mass agriculture, but they can help facilitate that as sort of a partner plant. Different mushrooms can control insect populations, so you can use that as sort of a pest control depending on what species are growing there. And the mycelium itself actually acts as a filter for groundwater because it's sort of so tightly knit. You can kind of picture like the filter in a fish tank. It's sort of that sponge kind of structure that's sort of woven, and it just kind of helps filter out detritus and debris. For mycoremediation, I think that this is really interesting. You can actually train a mushroom to decompose and digest different chemicals and things like plastic. There's
or
some
oil,
or
right?
oil. Yeah, there's
Mhm.
some use of mycelium for cleaning up oil spills. Or if you maybe parked your car in the gravel and you had an oil leak, you could potentially remediate the soil there using different types of mushrooms. I've heard that having been done with oyster mushrooms. You wouldn't want to eat the mushrooms growing out of the oil-soaked soil because they would probably have high levels of contaminants. So that wouldn't be safe to consume. But after several different cycles of, or blooms, I suppose, of the mushrooms, it'll actually suck the oil out of the soil, and down the road you might be able to use that area for a garden in maybe a zone that was completely unsafe for growing food beforehand. So you can really completely change the land that you're given depending on how you decide to use mycelium and mycoremediation.
Okay. So so one of the really cool things that I actually just learned about fungi from just creating this presentation is there are so many medicinal uses for fungi. So the biggest one again is penicillin. So that's one of the first things that was created using yeast, which is a type of fungi. And there's a lot of different medical effects attributed to fungi. So some of the things that you may have heard of is they have used fungi to create antiviral medications, antioxidants, even anti-inflammatory, and there's even some fungi out there that can help with diabetes. There's so many out there. So actually on this page, I'm going to be sending you this PowerPoint once we are finished. The picture on the right has a bunch of different ways certain species of mushrooms can be used medicinally and edibly. Is that a word? I'm not sure.
Culinarily.
Culinarily.
Just making up
words.
Yeah.
So it's just amazing, the world of fungi, how much they are actually used in that we're not aware of.
Mm-hmm. There's one that's called reishi mushroom. That's a type of polypore that's also known as the mushroom of immortality because it has so many medicinal uses and benefits. And it's used commonly in East Asian medicine. And I use it all the time. I had a really poor immune system quite a few years ago, and I started incorporating reishi mushroom along with a few other things like trying to make sleep a priority, but that's hit or miss for most people. But I did notice a huge difference after about a month or so of like incorporating reishi mushroom in like small amounts into my diet. So I have like a recipe for reishi and astragalus chai tea that's supposed to help with immune support for flu season. That's really nice, that I use at home from time to time. It's really bitter. Because it's a polypore, it's really woody, really dense. It's not like something you could just saute up and eat. Definitely better in like a tea form, which I think is true of most medicinal mushrooms. It's definitely not the most pleasant tasting, but it has many, many uses and helps in a lot of ways. There is a brand that sells like a a vegan chocolate milk that's reishi mushroom included for immune support. I believe it's Rebel brand. It's pretty decent non-dairy chocolate milk, and then it's got the benefit of boosting your immune system too, so can't go wrong.
Oh, so I just found this on the internet today. So this is just an example of how many different things fungi is used for to help produce. So anything from clothes to alcohol to our fuel, many of our foods. So then just goes back to just how fungi is so important, and we can find it everywhere in our environment and in our daily lives, even though we don't know it.
Mm-hmm. There is a packing company that's starting to use mycelium. So they're growing it into a specific mold, because mycelium will grow to the shape of whatever container you're growing it in. That's actually how we get a lot of the mushrooms that you buy in stores, like enoki mushrooms that you buy at a grocery store have this really long stem. They make a really good noodle substitute, honestly, but in nature, they've got a much thicker stem and a broader cap. So the one we see at the store is like a forced growing mutation version of it, because they grow it in these jars that have these very long, sort of narrow mouths. So it forces the shape of the mushroom to grow according to its environment. And yeah, the same goes for mycelium. So they've started using mycelium, growing it into like these specific forms for like packing and insulation. And then you bake it at a high temperature so that it kills the organism, but it retains the shape and the function. So that's an interesting way that fungi are sort of changing the world right now in a non-edible, non-medicinal way.
They're everywhere, even if we don't realize it. Okay.
So I wanted to talk a bit about mushroom farming and cultivation. These guys, the pink ones are actually pink oyster. The brown ones in the back are maitake, which are also known as hen of the woods. There is another type of mushroom called chicken of the woods that's like this bright orange one, completely different structure. And it's also known as a sulfur shelf. And when that's younger, you can eat it. As it gets older, it gets a lot more woody because it is a polypore. And the lighter mushroom pictured here is a king oyster. So these are some of the more common ones that are farmed, and they're growing out of what looks like grain spore. It could be a sawdust-based spore, but basically they take mushroom spores and inoculate a big mass of like sterilized cellulose-based or carbohydrate-based medium. So millet is a really common one, sawdust. I've seen it done with hay. Well, usually they'll take the grain spawn, like millet, and then inoculate the sterilized hay with it, so it's got that cellulose base to sort of grab hold of and decompose. And then the entire bag sort of becomes a mass of mycelium, and you can poke holes in it, and those holes will be where the mushroom fruits from. You just have to introduce water.
Oh, cool.
Oh, I did want to mention there's quite a few mushroom farms in Washington State and in our area. Let me find my group. And you can buy at-home growing kits. There's a few different companies that sell those. Sometimes you can even find them at farmers markets. But if you do that, don't set it on your kitchen counter as you're growing the mushrooms, because the spores will release in your house and you probably don't want to be breathing those in. So if you've got maybe a semi-warm spot in your garage or a porch that doesn't get too cold, that might be a good spot for them if you decide to do a take-home version. Some of the local mushroom farms are Provision mushrooms, which I believe is either in Shelton or Olympia, Cascadia mushrooms, Snow Valley mushrooms, which I think is located near Carnation. And you might also see them in grocery stores, something other than like shiitake or portobello. Occasionally those are foraged and not necessarily just farmed. So when you're seeing chanterelles in the store, those are most likely foraged for. But these different mushroom farms will have like people go and forage for them. They'll be like contracted, or maybe they'll work for the farm. So it'll still be sold under their name, but not necessarily grown in their facilities. Okay, so although this is not a foraging class, we did want to talk about some foraging practices. This is sort of a basic mushroom ID class. So if you guys are interested in foraging, we just want you to be very, very careful. We don't want to like send you out there and tell you very confidently that this is an edible species and have it be completely wrong and accidentally give yourself like gastrointestinal upset for days on end. So if you do decide to go foraging and that is something that you're interested in doing, you absolutely need to take a very experienced foraging guide with you. Not just the first time, but for many times until you're confident at least IDing one type of mushroom, then you know, I have one that I can pick and that is safe. And if you are looking at mushrooms that you're not quite sure is the species you're looking for, or you think might be this one, you can test it without poisoning yourself. And the way that you do that is by taking like a pinky nail sized sample of it, just pinching it off of the cap. And then if you lean forward, you can put it to the tip of your tongue and chew it with your front teeth. You don't want it to go anywhere towards the back of your throat because you don't want to accidentally swallow it. So if you nibble a little bit and then spit it out, you can taste the general taste of the mushroom, the general flavor. Some are more peppery, some are very bitter, some are more mild and seafoody. So based on that, that's another factor that can help you ID a mushroom. If you know that like, oh, this specific one is going to taste peppery and it doesn't, then that's probably not the one you're looking for. So that's one way to be careful, to be a little adventurous, but not accidentally poison yourself. Other rules of thumb are avoid places that have environmental contaminants. So if you go foraging and you see like an abandoned TV that's been shot up in the forest, don't pick mushrooms from there because that's an area that's likely got other kinds of litter and other kinds of contaminant in the soil. And you don't want to be unintentionally ingesting those toxins. So beware of that. Avoid picking in graveyards. This is something that Annalie brought up and I was like, oh, that makes sense. But we had like two different reasons for why it makes sense. And her reason was, well, you don't want something that's been growing on a human. And I was like, yeah, humans eat all these different kinds of medicines and toxins. You don't want to re-ingest that. So it was kind of an interesting, yeah. And then you also want to avoid the roadside for the same reason that I said you could use different mushrooms for oil remediation from soil. You don't want to be eating those if it's got like roadside runoff because you just don't know what's in there. If you go foraging, try to be mindful of what you're picking. Always leave 2/3 of what you see. Even though the mycelium is the underground structure and you're not really necessarily disturbing it too much by picking the mushrooms, it's a good practice just in case to help preserve the mushroom and the mycelium growing. You can use a woven basket to collect the mushrooms, so that lets spores and bugs escape, which like furthers the survival of the mycelium and the mushroom species. Or when you're picking the mushroom, you can like tap the top of the cap a few times to help release some of the spores for continued propagation. So one of the resources we found for foraging is the Puget Sound Mycological Society. They're a local society and you can become a member. I think there's a yearly fee. I haven't signed up yet. I'm going to put it on my Christmas list maybe, but they have a lot of resources and classes that you can take about mushroom ID, mushroom foraging, all kinds of different things. I think there's some culinary related classes in there too. But if you're looking for some further resources, this is a great source. And I actually have this book that I've borrowed from the library. It's really, really a great resource. There's not every single species. It's definitely not a big enough book for that. But it's got some good representation. What I like to do when I'm out for a walk is if I spot a mushroom, I'll take a picture of it from the top, from underneath if I can. I'll take a picture of the stem. I usually won't pick it to take a picture of the butt end of the stem. But occasionally I will, if I see a huge amount of them, then I'm like, okay, well, I'm not going to feel bad about picking one so that I can get a picture to help me ID it later. And then I'll sit down with one of my guidebooks and look at the picture and sort of flip through and say, okay, well, I can see that this has gills, or I can see that this has ridges. And I can see that the stem is central or off to the side, and I can see maybe even what color it bruises if you're picking it. Some mushrooms bruise blue, which is really interesting. You can see if the gills are disturbed, if it produces sort of a milky fluid. It might be lactarius. But yeah, so it's, if you're out for a walk, take some pictures. And then, like I said, this guidebook doesn't have pictures of everything, but it's got some good general ones. And it's got really good descriptions in it as well.
Can I see it for a second?
Yeah,
and again, one more thing too, because our purpose of this presentation is just to hopefully get you confident with talking about the types of mushrooms. So this book also, I'm not sure if you guys will be able to see it, also has all of the types of mushrooms that we covered at the beginning of the presentation right inside. So it's kind of a helpful tool just to put this in your backpack, and you can just hopefully ID that mushroom down to the type, and that can help you. And then for identifying mushrooms down to the species, that's where we highly recommend that you go out with a foraging guide for those sorts of things.
Absolutely. I think there's even, there's a tape measure on the back cover of this if you're trying to measure how big the cap is, because some stuff, it won't grow past a certain size, and some stuff will surprise you and grow to a huge amount. I think there's a picture in one of my other guidebooks of like a small child sitting on a log, and there's some mushroom caps that are like 1.5 feet in diameter popping up next to him.
Wow, that's huge.
This is actually that book. So All That the Rain Promises and More has a ton of really funny anecdotes in it. Apparently the guy on the cover was about to play in a symphony and spotted some chanterelles in the forest right next to the, or in the field right next to the building, and just dashed off 10 minutes before the performance and picked as many as he could find. So I get it. They're not the easiest to find. But so that's how the picture on the cover came about. And I just think it's hilarious. It's got the scientific names of all the mushrooms within it and the more common names. And then it's got tips as to whether or not that is a poisonous species, or if it's easy to identify an edible version, or if it's like you need to really, really, really be confident that this is the right one, otherwise you might accidentally kill yourself. There's a family of mushrooms that I had meant to mention earlier that I was reading about. It was like some of the most poisonous known to man. And I think it was related to the inky cap mushroom that I was talking about at the beginning. I think it's called like the Angel of Death. And it's just very, very toxic.
And then again, both of these books that we have that we just showed you examples of, we checked out at a local library. So if you are interested in looking at these types of books before you decide to buy them, I recommend going and looking at your library first. And then another option is actually Amazon. You can find a lot of these on there used or new for a much cheaper price.
Yeah, I know that some libraries have sort of limited accessibility right now because of COVID. So like the library I got these from is from Basidiomycota University, and they have like, they quarantine the books for 3 days after you return them, and you sort of have to pre-select them online before you go and pick them up. So that might be the case for a lot of other local libraries. So just something to keep in mind if you're planning on going and perusing the stacks, that might not be an option, but now you have a couple titles that you know you could look for. Anything by Paul Stamets is going to be a really wonderful book. He's an expert mycologist, and I believe he was the one in the movie we were talking about, Fantastic Fungi.
And I think that's on the next slide. Yes, here it is. So these are just some resources for further learning. So Fantastic Fungi is an amazing documentary. I'm probably going to watch it more than once. And Paul, he's the one that created this documentary. And I believe Marina said that he is one of the head mycology professors at the University of Washington. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I know he's affiliated with them at least.
Yeah.
He's definitely, I follow him on Instagram. He posts a lot of educational and interesting stuff on a regular basis, and he goes on forest walks on a regular basis too. So occasionally he'll put a video up of him with like a giant mushroom or like an ancient agaricon growing out of the tree. Some really cool content.
Yeah, and you can follow him on Instagram. And then this documentary we found on Amazon. You can rent it for $4.99. And one of the most amazing things is it's really hard to visualize mycelium because most of it's underground. And this documentary has an amazing, oh gosh, what's the word am I coming for?
Representation.
Yeah, representation of kind of how mycelium works so that plants can communicate with each other.
It does also talk quite a bit about polycybe mushrooms, which are, psilocybin mushrooms. I think they're called polycybes, but psilocybe, there we go. So those are the hallucinogenic mushrooms, the magic mushrooms. Actually, recently they were decriminalized. Just with this last election, it was voted to decriminalize them in the United States. And there have been a lot of studies on medicinal uses for them for psychological disorders and treating different things related to that. They've seen quite a bit of success for people essentially microdosing. Like it's a very, very, very small dosage that's prescribed and taken to help manage things like bipolar, depression. I think there might be some for polycystic ovarian syndrome.
In the documentary, one of the examples they talked about was a stutter. So this person took a very low dose of these type of mushrooms and it helped with the stutter.
I think that one was actually his first hallucinogenic experience and took quite a bit of it. So we don't suggest that. Definitely, we're not sitting here trying to suggest you guys taking magic mushrooms. I just wanted to give a heads up in that is a lot of the content for this specific movie.
And then this one.
Oh, and then there is a Facebook page as well for mushroom identification. If you guys are active on Facebook and are interested in joining, it's got a lot of different tips and things from people posting different mushrooms that they got questions about. You can kind of become a bit of a hive mind in there and identify things, get questions answered, ask. Maybe you find that you've become really familiar with one specific type and you can answer someone else's questions as well. Right, and this is more on the Puget Sound Mycological Society. I think they've got an example for one of their classes.
Okay, so now this is the time that we can open it up for questions. So if any of you have questions, you're welcome to kind of write them in the chat, or you're welcome to unmute yourself as well. Let's see.
We're going to pause the screen share for now. Our second computer has died. I forgot to plug it in. So I don't have visibility on the chat stream right now, but we will momentarily.
Okay, how do I get to the, all right, here we go. Okay, so in the meantime, while we're waiting for questions to come in, if you guys are interested in learning more or even coming and visiting Shadow Lake Nature Preserve, we are on Facebook, we are on Instagram, and we also have our website as well. So I'm actually gonna screen share one more time so I can share these with you. Okay, let me go to the next slide real fast. Oh, it's at the, oh gosh, I'm sorry, everybody. I don't know what just happened. But essentially, so where you signed up for this class, that is where we post all of our future events. So we normally don't host anything in December or January, but up in February and March, we will have other community classes that we are working on right now. So all of that will be on our website, or we will post it on Facebook and Instagram as well.
All right, so I've got a question from Anna. What are the defining characteristics of boletes? So I'm gonna pull out my mushroom journal really quick. I had taken a class a little bit ago and I have a sort of hiking journal that I'll take with me and occasionally will like press leaves and things in. And I've also got some notes. I'm gonna do this, sorry.
Yeah, sorry, I'm gonna stop this real quick.
About different mushrooms in it. So some of the defining characteristics for boletes, they have a polypore underside. So the underside of the cap ranges in color from like a cream to sort of more of a yellow. And it's got just those tubes. So it's not gills, but it's sort of like a sponge. And it's got a central stalk that has reticulations on it. So reticulations are sort of like a fishnet kind of webbing pattern to it. I don't know. Yeah, you can sort of see from the picture from our slideshow, it's not like a smooth textured stalk necessarily. It's sort of got like a webbing look to it. And then the tops are usually sort of a brownish color, brown to red. They range in color quite a bit depending on the species. And do I have anything else I want to say to that? The flesh of them, when you cut it, is white. Some species bruise blue. Those are not the ones that you want to pick if you decide that that's a foraging adventure you're going on. So if it bruises brew for bolete, don't do it.
Okay.
And yes, you did spell it correct. There's a few different spellings. One's got a B-O-L-E-T-U-S versus bolete. Right. And then we've got a question from Kara. Do we use any phone apps? So I have one, but I haven't really used it yet. I'm a little skeptical when you have to set up an account for apps, but that's just me. It's called iNaturalist. And this was suggested to me from a foraging class that I took a few months ago. So it's through National Geographic and California Academy of Sciences, and it's iNaturalist, like iPhone. It's got a green bird as the emblem. And with that app, you can take pictures and share from when you're out on a hike or wandering through the forest, and you can share your location and either identify or get help identifying what that species is. You might see other people from that same area have posted this species. You can also use it to sort of locate something that you might be looking for. So you're really interested in one species of mushroom and you see in this area, a lot of people have posted that they found them there. People might not post like an exact GPS location. They might post like a region of a park maybe, or like they might post in a specific park. And so that can help you sort of locate and identify. And you can also sort of join in discussions on those different species and environments.
Awesome. Oh, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to go back to our PowerPoint again real quick to share those resources with you. Oh, one more thing. So Marina, she is just the culinary expert. So if any of you guys did have any questions about how to cook with mushrooms, she is your woman. So I think she wanted to touch on some of those things real quick, just in case any of you guys were curious.
I think, so one of the things I wanted to share is I don't really forage for mushrooms. I'm just not that experienced yet or confident. And I'm not willing to accidentally poison myself in the journey. So I buy all my mushrooms at the grocery store, farmer's market. And if it's something new and I'm at a farmer's market, I'll usually ask for suggestions, how they would suggest I cook it. So that's how I got the crab cake sort of recipe for the lion's mane that we looked at earlier. But otherwise, if I just buy like a pack of mushrooms at the store that I've not used before, I'll just saute them in like olive oil or butter, maybe a little bit of salt and pepper, or maybe not. And then just try them out that way. I really love mushroom toast. So I'll like, if I'm trying mushrooms for the first time, maybe just throw it on a piece of sourdough bread after I've sauteed it, like sourdough toast, and then you've got an excellent snack or breakfast. Chanterelles are wonderful that way. Otherwise, I really feel like you can't go wrong just sauteing it with olive oil and garlic. It's a good standby. Some mushrooms are really delicate, and so you don't want to cook them for too long, but most mushrooms you don't necessarily want to eat raw. I know sometimes like cremini mushrooms or like the white button mushrooms are sort of served raw on tops of salads, and those are fine, but I definitely prefer the cooked versions.
Yeah, so again, I can't reinforce it enough. Please do not eat anything unless you know exactly what it is. So that's why it's so important to go with a foraging guide that can help you. And I believe you can find a lot of those courses through the mycological, sorry, what's it called?
Yeah, Puget Sound Mycological Society.
Yep. So that's where you should go if you want to look for local guides who are going to be taking people out on those tours.
There is also a note, if you're trying a mushroom, even if it's from the grocery store that's brand new to you, it might not be a toxic mushroom, but people react differently to different things. So what's maybe categorized as a non-toxic mushroom might still have like gastrointestinal effects for you. So in order to like try and avoid that, if you're trying a mushroom that's brand new to you, sorry, it's having burp for a moment. Try a very small amount and then wait 24 hours to see how you react to it. I don't want you to like sit and eat a pound of mushrooms that you've never tried before in your life and just have a bad time afterwards. So approach with caution.
All right, so we will end with this slide right here. So this is just if you want to stay in touch with Shadow Lake Nature Preserve and see what we are up to. So you can like us on Facebook. We put most of our events. We are creating some virtual nature walk videos. We will actually have one for mushrooms that we're going to put up in the near future. You can also follow us on Instagram for fun plant facts and other things that are going on at the Nature Preserve. And then also our website is a great spot to look for upcoming events. Again, December and January are our slow months for environmental education programming, but it will start kicking back up in February and March, and we'll have more community classes like this. And then one last thing too, we do send out a monthly newsletter with fun, cool facts about native species of the month, other cool science communication articles that we feel that are interesting for our community members to learn about. And if you are interested in receiving our monthly newsletter, feel free to just email me after this webinar. So it's just Annalee@shadowhabitat.org. It's the same email that you got for this Zoom invitation. And I would be happy to add you to that list so you can stay in the loop of kind of what's going on out at the Nature Preserve. And one more thing too, if you did want to come out and see our iconic bog, we do have trail reservations, so that's how it is COVID friendly. So you can just go on our website and schedule a time to come out and have the boardwalk to yourselves and see if you can find any cool fungi that is growing out there right now.
All right. I think we're going to check questions one last time.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Well, it looks like we don't have any other questions. So I just want to thank you all so much for being a part of our Fungi for Beginners course. And again, if you have any other questions, feel free to email me at Annalee@shadowhabitat.org, and I'd be happy to answer those. So,
yeah. Thank you guys so much for joining. We really appreciate it.
Yeah. All right. Have a great night, everybody.